Well, thank you all for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure to be in this very historic place. And the topic I'm going to discuss is incredibly relevant to the history of this place, and I will touch on that. My title today is In Experts We Trust, with a question mark. The experts have come in for a great deal of criticism of late. The turning point was probably the 2008 financial crisis, which was seen as a failure of mainstream economists as well as of the establishment more generally, who had previously touted the benefits of a system that came crashing down on the heads of ordinary people. There was another wave of expert skepticism after the Eurozone crisis in 2011, which was perceived as an elite project that had painful consequences for the public, particularly in the periphery countries of the Eurozone. And this was compounded by a conduct crisis, where scandals broke out around mis-selling, around manipulation of LIBOR and of foreign exchange markets, which only strengthened the suspicion that the system was rigged in favor of the rich and the powerful. Experts who were seen as the handmaiden of this system were seen to be responsible for many of these ills, and their credibility and the lack thereof loomed very large in the Brexit debate. In addition to experts having got it wrong, their monopoly on opinion has been weakened by technology. Social media and the internet have contributed to disintermediating experts as information has become more widely available, as news has become more targeted to individual interests and preferences, and as people can increasingly choose who to trust and who to follow. So who needs experts when you've got Facebook, Google, Mumsnet, Twitter? Better to rely on oneself and one's own networks of trusted friends rather than experts who are in the pockets of corporations, banks, and political parties. Now, this evening I want to explore these developments because I think they speak to some of the most important issues of our time. They will determine the quality of politics and policies in the future, who is trusted and why. And there are also some important lessons, I think, for policymakers, as well as for universities, who in the end are factories for producing experts, and the place in which a great deal of expert debate happens. So, my first question is, what have the experts ever done for us? Well, we've gained about 20 years of life expectancy since 1950 as a result of gains in water, sanitation, and healthcare. Millions used to die of very treatable illnesses like diarrhea and influenza. Polio used to paralyze 350,000 people every year, as recently as 1988. Today it's been virtually eradicated. Average world incomes have increased more than 20-fold, from $446 to $10,057 as a result of improved economic policies, particularly in the developing world. The proportion of people living in poverty has fallen from 44% in 1990 to only 11% in 2013. And while the global population has gone up from 5 billion to 7 billion, the number of people going to bed hungry has actually fallen from about 1 billion to 795 million. So the application of expertise has given us not just aqueducts, sanitation, roads, education, and wine. It's given us much, much more. And so with those achievements in mind, it's not surprising that many decisions have been increasingly delegated to experts. Now, by experts, I mean people who have invested a lot of time in developing a deep knowledge of a particular subject, usually with credentials and ongoing professional development to maintain their skills. Now, since the time when Caesar first introduced the Julian calendar, based on expert advice to prevent the pontifex from manipulating the dates to favor their political allies, politicians have turned to experts to help them make better decisions. And the mechanisms for doing this have varied over time. Trusted advisors, independent commissions tasked with solving a particular problem, expert witnesses that appear before courts or before Parliament, or creating expert institutions with clearly defined mandates to deliver a policy objective. So a well-known example of such technocracy, as I'll call it, in action, is the UK's National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which is tasked with making the difficult choices about which treatments the NHS will fund. And that ensures that those very difficult decisions are made on the basis of medical science and rigorous cost-benefit analysis, and insulates politicians from lobbying by different interest groups to request different treatments be funded. Now, another important example of such delegation of decisions to experts is the creation of independent central banks, like where I work, the Bank of England. Frustration with high inflation in the 1970s made many countries move toward depoliticizing decisions about monetary policy and interest rates. Now, research suggested that there was political pressure led to an inflation bias in policymaking, which could be solved by delegating responsibility to central banks. The following decade saw a clear trend globally toward giving central banks greater independence. According to one very widely used index, for example, 85% of central banks, of modern central banks, had some degree of independence by the early 2000s, compared to less than 40% in the 70s and 80s. And there is now considerable evidence that countries that have given central banks greater independence have been more successful at maintaining low and stable inflation. Similarly, many countries have tried to insulate fiscal policy from the political cycle. So, for example, when I was at the IMF, we observed a very clear pattern of countries running big fiscal deficits in the run-up to an election because they wanted to buy political support from key constituencies. And invariably, that was followed by a crisis in which budget austerity and monetary tightening was necessary to restore stability. To dampen this cycle of boom and bust, many countries introduced independent fiscal councils. In the UK, for example, we have the Office for Budget Responsibility. Those independent fiscal councils independently assess the government's fiscal plans, and they produce macroeconomic forecasts that are independent of government. And a review of international experience of these fiscal councils, which have been introduced in dozens of countries now, are that they do improve fiscal outcomes when they are operationally independent, when they have strong public engagement, and when they have an explicit role in monitoring compliance against fiscal policy rules. So those are some good examples, but experts have also gotten it wrong some of the time, such as not warning about the financial crisis in 2008. During a famous visit by the Queen to the London School of Economics in 2008, my future employer, she asked a very simple question: why did nobody anticipate the credit crunch? The answer, which came in a letter which was signed by 33 of the most distinguished economists in the country, admitted that, and I'll quote what the letter said, "The failure to foresee the timing, extent, and severity of the crisis and to head it off was principally a failure of collective imagination of many bright people, both in this country and internationally, to understand the risks to the system as a whole." The letter ends by noting the importance of dissecting the lessons learned and applying them in the future and being candid about those findings. Sometimes expert systems to control quality also fail. One of the most infamous examples is that of the 1998 study based on just 12 children, which was published in The Lancet and claimed that there was a link between MMR vaccine and autism. Because of that study, uptake of the MMR vaccine plummeted and fell to just 80% nationally, and mumps reached epidemic proportions in the UK in 2005. It later transpired that the lead author of this study had failed to disclose his role as a paid advisor in a legal dispute claiming that MMR harmed children. He was eventually struck off, and later studies have failed to establish any credible link between the vaccine and autism, and The Lancet has had to fully retract the article. Another catastrophic examples of expertise being misused is the example of the South African President Thabo Mbeki, who rejected consensus expert opinion about how to treat HIV/AIDS. He favored the views of an unusual professor at the University of California who argued that AIDS was caused by malnutrition, not by a virus. Mbeki's refusal to believe in and fund mainstream treatments of HIV resulted in 300,000 lives lost and 35,000 children born HIV positive, which could have been averted. So these failures underline the importance of experts being subject to challenge and having rigorous processes to differentiate good experts from bad ones. Historically, some of the best challenge has come from the process of scientific discovery and from other experts peer reviewing that of others. Karl Popper, a philosopher who was also at the LSE, argued that in a world of uncertainty and complexity, we cannot know the truth. All we can do is have increasingly better guesses and weed out falsehoods. And scientific progress occurs as evidence accumulates and we make better and better guesses. In academic life, this process is based on principles like the need for researchers to be disinterested, to have no material stake in the outcome of their research, and in subjecting themselves to peer review and the rigors of challenge by your colleagues. And in many disciplines, they have to make their data available so that other scholars can replicate their results. Now let me say a few words about the changing context in which expertise is being used. Today, experts face a new set of challenges in the form of the dilution of their monopoly over authoritative opinion. Technology has changed the amount of information people have access to, the way they get it, and how they form their opinions. According to a report by the Reuters Institute here at Oxford University, half of people with online access use social media as a news source, the number having doubled in the US just since 2013. Young people, the exact demographic in this room between age 18 to 24, are particularly reliant on social media. And I'll show you a graph, which I think, here we are, which shows you where people get their news from depending on their age. And clearly, the red bars to the right, which are the young ones, are far more dependent on online and social media than the purple bars, the over 55s. Now, media has always been open to the criticism that it tells people what they want to hear. But the selection and delivery of news by algorithms, which guesses users' preferences based on what they've liked before, would seem to dramatically increase the risk of living one's life in an informational echo chamber. The digitization of knowledge and the fact that it's usually freely available has been hugely democratizing and empowering for people to help them shape their views. Individuals can go to the doctor much better informed about alternative treatments doing their own research on the internet. The wisdom of crowds can generate better restaurant reviews, ratings of products and services, and alternative perspectives on a wide range of issues. And trust can be built by studying the likes and dislikes of other users and by reviewing the thousands of independent reviews by other individuals. So that's the upside. But there has also been a downside. People can be overwhelmed by information that's difficult to verify. Algorithms can create echo chambers of the like-minded who are never challenged. Fake news distorts reality. Post-truth fosters cynicism. And anonymity bestows power on individuals who can abuse it. And a world in which more clicks mean more revenues rewards those who are the most shrill and encourages the most extreme views. Now, experts whose job it is to sift through all the information and make judgments are just one of many voices in this internet cacophony. And the inaccessible language that they use often means they are the least heard. Experts define themselves by what's called boundary work, which defines the boundaries between them and non-experts. That boundary work can include things like credentials, degrees, jargon, control over journals, and control over the training of the next generation of experts. But this boundary work can also reduce experts' effectiveness, especially in a world where there are many alternative sources of views. A recent blog that we did at the Bank of England looked at the linguistic complexity of our work relative to others. And what we found is on the bottom you have the literacy grade of adults, and on the top you have the percent of the population who are proficient. And you can see Bank of England publications tend to require a very high level of literacy, which less than 1 in 5 of the population in the UK have. So we've learned in the Bank of England that talking about things like prices and jobs is far more effective than using economist jargon of inflation and employment. And in preparing this speech, I was very pleased that my speech fit in an intermediate level of complexity of that of a tabloid newspaper or a political speech, which shows that you can speak in relatively accessible language even on complicated subjects. Experts' attempts to make themselves heard is also made more difficult by the changing landscape of trust. The age of deference is over. But if you look at something called the Edelman Trust Barometer for 2017, it finds that in 2/3 of countries, less than 50% of the population trust mainstream institutions of business, government, media, and NGOs to do what is right. Now, it's important to note that measuring trust is perilous. We don't have longitudinal data, and that declining trend is not the same everywhere. But I think the current crisis of trust, which is usually associated with the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession, the adverse effects of globalization, technology, and a number of very high-profile examples of untrustworthy behavior by politicians, banks, and various other institutions. The response to this lack of trust is for people to look elsewhere. So in surveys, people will define a person like yourself as far more credible than an academic or technical expert, and certainly more credible than a CEO or a government official, reflecting a shift toward trust being toward people you know and family and friends that we've seen on social media. So, what do we do about this predicament? Let me move to my more sort of forward-looking, policy-oriented theme, which is how do we develop an agenda to rebuild trustworthiness of experts? I think we need expertise more than ever to solve the world's problems. But we're in a time in which confidence in experts is at an all-time low. And many are trying to think about ways to restore trust in experts and institutions. Honora O'Neill gave a very thoughtful Wreath lectures recently, where she was quite skeptical that requiring ever greater transparency was going to enhance trust, and having ever more box-ticking accountability was going to help. Transparency is not good enough if information is inaccessible and unaccessible. Instead, what we need to do is focus not on increasing trust, but in increasing trustworthiness. And I think society has two ways of doing this. One, through legislation, regulation, or guidance that sets standards, often accompanied by requirements to check that you're complying with those standards. And second, by providing information that empowers individuals to assess trustworthiness for themselves. And let me give some examples of how I think that might work. First is I think experts need to embrace uncertainty. One of the previous governor at the Bank of England, Mervyn King, once said, we have to resist the pressure for the illusion of certainty. Every time I talk to a journalist or someone in financial markets, they want a precise number, down to the third decimal point preferably, of what GDP or inflation is going to be. It would be an illusion, it would be a lie for me to give them such a number, because we can't possibly forecast with that degree of precision. I mean, Bertrand Russell once said, the whole problem of the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, but wiser people are so full of doubts. So much of the public debate tries to paint everything as black or white, when the world is far, far more colorful. We're uncertain not just about whether our models are calibrated correctly, but whether they're even the right models to be using. And rather than pretending to be certain and risk frequently getting it wrong, I think being candid about uncertainty will, over the longer term, build the credibility of experts. A good example of this is the fan charts that we use in the Monetary Policy Committee as part of our forecasting process. So we will forecast a number, but we will have a fan chart which has an array of probabilities around what the possible outcome could be under different circumstances. Now, conveying uncertainty, however, increases the complexity of your message and making it increasingly difficult in a world in where everything is short form. For example, it's much easier to tweet Bank of England forecasts growth of 2% than it is to tweet, if economic circumstances identical to today were to prevail on 100 occasions, the best collective judgment of the Monetary Policy Committee is that the mature estimate of GDP growth would lie above 2% on 50 occasions and below 2% on 50 occasions, which would be a much more accurate depiction of what our fan chart is saying. The challenge for experts today is how to communicate with brevity, but without bravado. The second part of an agenda for rebuilding trustworthiness is that good practices need to become much more widespread in the media. Good standards and practices are important given the vital role that the media plays in any democracy and in mediating the views of experts. And those good practices exist in many places. But the economics of the industry has created a dangerous trend where the unwillingness to pay for content means that financial pressures squeeze out higher quality reporting. Many news organizations now rely on something called native advertising, where a product is promoted under the guise of a news story, and only if you read the fine print can you tell the difference between a news story and an advertisement. And perhaps as a result, trust in mainstream media has plummeted more than any other institution and is now distrusted in 80% of countries. This has been exacerbated recently by the rise of fake news and the phenomenon of false equivalence, whereby in the name of balanced reporting, news organizations give equal time to credible experts and less credible ones. So how can producers of information and expertise balance the need for reliability with allowing different views to be heard? What is the balance between freedom of speech and the media's duty to inform? Well, few institutions value freedom of speech more than universities. The academy has a special role to play in the ecosystem of ideas by providing an independent place where views are subjected to scrutiny and challenge and judged by rigorous standards. Universities have well-established policies for governing this process of judging what is truly an intellectual contribution. These principles are enshrined in things like the Haldane Principle, which says that subjects of research should be chosen by scholars and not by politicians. Practices such as peer review, competitive processes for funding research, requirements to publish data and be transparent about who is funding and where conflicts of interest may lie are very well established in the academic world. Now, perhaps some of those standards and principles could be spread more widely than in academia and maybe adapted to the world of think tanks, websites, and the media. For example, should think tanks have to report transparently where their funding comes from? Should journalists and bloggers be exposed for reporting or recirculating falsehoods or rumors? Should digital platforms take greater responsibility for their content as part of their duty to inform and to protect their own brands? The debate on standards and good practice has just begun, but is very, very welcome. The third part of my agenda for trustworthiness is that we need to provide the public with better tools to assess trustworthiness. Now, it's almost impossible to imagine a return to an age when large media companies control the flow of information, a small number of political parties dominate the political discourse, and professionals of all sorts are trusted unquestioningly. Therefore, it's even more important that citizens are able to assess the quality of the flood of information and opinions they receive and to differentiate facts from falsehood. Now, the online commerce world has developed many tools to inform judgments about who to trust, such as ratings provided by other consumers, feedback on the reliability of other users, data on performance measures such as timeliness of delivery. So what tools might be relevant for the world of ideas? In some instances, traditional institutions have evolved to meet this need. So, for example, NHS Direct, or in the US, something called the National Institutes of Health for the public, are websites that are a good response to the phenomenon of patients coming into surgeries armed with reams of data and views from the internet and completely confused about what they should do about their own health. These authoritative websites provide a reliable source of information to discerning patients who would otherwise have to sift through sometimes very contradictory information from multiple sources. In other instances, non-traditional sources of judging the quality of information have emerged. So, for example, fact-checking websites who appraise the veracity of claims made by politicians are one example and have a lot of similarities to peer review in the academic context. Fact-checkers, too, have now developed a code of conduct to enable users to assess the veracity of their work. There have also been some examples of new institutions being created to enhance trustworthiness in areas where trust has eroded. So, two of them that I've been involved in the wake of the misconduct scandals in financial markets around mis-selling of financial products, LIBOR and foreign exchange markets, two institutions were created to try and address those. One, the Banking Standards Board, which tries to address and focus on improving conduct standards in banks. The second, the FIC Market Standards Board, tries to preempt future problems by establishing acceptable standards of practice in wholesale financial markets. These initiatives will take time to bear fruit, but they're a good example of trying to rebuild trustworthiness when it has lapsed. And schools and universities will have to do more to educate students to be more discerning consumers of information, and maybe public awareness campaigns on media literacy will become important. In a really striking piece of research that was done in the US by the Stanford History Education Group, they tested thousands and thousands of students in secondary school, primary school, and at university in the US, across the country. And they concluded that young people's ability to reason about information on the internet could be summed up by one word: bleak. They tested students on whether they could distinguish an ad from a news story, or whether they noticed that data in a chart came from a political lobbying group. At every case, they said, and at every level, we were taken aback by students' lack of preparation. At present, we worry that democracy is threatened by the ease at which disinformation about civic issues is allowed to spread and flourish. In a world where information is plentiful, the future of education will be about training for critical thinking and creating citizens who can make good judgments. The fourth piece of my agenda for trustworthiness is listening to others. In a wonderful book by Jonathan Haidt, he talks about how humans are prone to what he calls groupish righteousness. And that's how we think about, how we make moral judgments about important issues. And social media exacerbates that tendency by providing the ability to communicate exclusively among the like-minded, with the shrillness enabled by anonymity. But we can all make an effort to engage with views that are different from our own and resist being algorithmically channeled into an echo chamber. And perhaps there could even be algorithms that enabled such bubble bursting. At the end of the day, even when all the facts are truthfully established, differences of opinion can legitimately exist, even amongst experts, Many of you have probably heard the famous joke about the US president who asked to see he wanted to have a one-handed economist, because every time he asked an economist a question, he'd say, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, I just want one with one hand. Institutions like the Oxford Union were established as a forum for discussion and debate at a time when the free exchange of ideas was a notion foreign to the restrictive universities' authorities. We need such institutions now more than ever, and in all parts of society, more than ever, where thesis meets antithesis and we get a new synthesis, where rigorous debate is the order of the day and conflicting views have to confront each other. And all of us as individuals have a responsibility to be more open and to engage respectfully with different views if we're going to have a constructive political debate and about the issues that matter to all of us, which is why I wanted to give this speech here. Now, the fifth piece of my agenda for trustworthiness is managing the boundary between technocracy and democracy carefully. How do we get the balance right between things that need to be decided by experts and things that need to be decided by politicians? Not surprisingly, the growth in the space that's been occupied by experts has resulted in some resentment of unelected officials making decisions that have huge social consequences. Problems often arise when experts try to be politicians or when politicians try to be experts. And clarity about those roles is really critical. I've spent much of my career managing that boundary between experts and politicians. In the UK civil service, there's the Northcote-Trevelyan principle, which ensures that recruits are selected on merit rather than through political patronage. And there's a well-established principle that civil servants advise and ministers decide. At both the World Bank and the IMF, where I worked, the job of the expert staff was to provide the best technical advice on policy issues. And if there were political trade-offs to be made, they were done at the level of the board, which represented the 189 countries that were members of the World Bank and the IMF. If experts cross that line, they undermine the credibility of their expertise and their accountability to their professional standards. And if politicians cross that line, they risk misleading the public who elected them to look out for their interests. Now, independent institutions like the civil service, like central banks, like universities, have a special role in mediating expertise in the public interest. But technocracy can only ever derive its authority from democracy. For that reason, there has been an exponential increase in mechanisms to hold experts to account, as more decisions require technical input. Michael Power describes the proliferation of such activity in a book he calls The Audit Society. Not just financial audits, but audits and reviews of boards, research quality, process reviews, environmental impact assessment, independent evaluations, parliamentary inquiries, etc., etc., etc. Now, critics argue that all of this bean counting, as it's often derogatorily described as, results in risk aversion and wastes resources from important work. Now, I've been on the receiving end of a lot of this checking and auditing, and it is uncomfortable. It's often very uncomfortable. But I think it's a small price to pay to legitimize expert input to democratic decision-making. Let me conclude. So what have the experts done for us? I would argue that the application of knowledge and the accumulation of that through education and dissemination through various media and institutions are an integral part of human progress. So the question is not how to manage without experts, but how to ensure there are mechanisms in place to ensure they are trustworthy. More humility and candor about the limits of expertise is a starting point, as is clearer communication. More rigorous assessment of ideas will generate better solutions. Better tools to allow the public to differentiate among ideas are also needed, as is the need to encourage more genuine listening to others' views. Managing the boundaries and accountabilities between experts and politicians will help maintain the balance between technocracy and democracy. Getting this right is vital for determining whether our futures are shaped by ignorance and narrow-mindedness or by knowledge and informed debate. Thank you very much.
Excellent. I'll begin by asking some of my own questions before passing over to students in the audience. And my first question is with regards to what you just said, and it is clear from your speech that experts have lost their reputation and their trust. Why haven't these experts realized that they've lost this trust and tried to readjust the way they carry the information across?
I think that process of trying to think about how to restore trustworthiness is just beginning. I think the changes that I described, the changing media landscape, the fact that people can get information so freely from so many multiple sources, this is all very recent. And experts did used to have a monopoly on a great deal of information and analysis in the past. But I think citizens and consumers of expertise are more demanding and more sophisticated, and I think experts need to change the way they engage with the public in order to respond to this very new and different world.
Do you think the general public is therefore overreacting, and this disequilibrium will naturally sort itself out once experts adjust?
I don't think it will sort itself out naturally. I think things have to happen. I think there has to be, I think experts have to change the way they engage, not be seduced by the quick headline, and being willing to acknowledge that there's uncertainty, that things are a little bit complicated, and that will over time build credibility. But I also think the public will need to be given new tools, new ways of being able to judge expertise. I think things like fact-checking are going to spread and change the way that people read news. I think business models of much of the media are very much in flux, and over time people will have to judge whether they're willing to pay for information that is more reliable, frankly. And I think citizens themselves will, over time, develop better skills. I think it's partly a generational thing too. I think the younger generation, which has grown up with this technology, will increasingly develop, and over time, the skills to distinguish between what is good knowledge and good information and good expertise and what isn't.
So one of the way experts carry the information across is through mass media, and I want to show you an article by the Financial Times, which was published yesterday, saying that the Bank of England is not able to forecast the next recession, hinting at its ineffectiveness, rather than the fact that there are a number of different paths that the UK can take following Brexit. Is that fake news? And if you can't rely on the FT to deliver the news, then who do you rely on?
Yes. I think what my colleagues on the Monetary Policy Committee were trying to convey in that story was there are a huge range of outcomes that could happen with Brexit, and it would be a false precision to imply that we could predict what GDP is going to be in 3 years' time when so much is unknown. And I think we just have to get people used to that reality. And newspapers, there is a sort of gotcha culture in the media. But I think it's more of a risk to succumb to that and provide false precision, because they'll get you very quickly. Whereas if you keep insisting that, this issue is complicated, there are all these things that could happen. If this happens, this is what will happen to the economy. If that happens, this is what will happen. That is a much more honest, grown-up discussion. And I think we need to insist on having a grown-up discussion on these really important issues.
Right. Well, let's move to your career, and along with the CEO Charlotte Hogg, you are the only two female governors of the Bank of England right now. Just how much more difficult it is for women to get there in comparison to a man?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's how much more difficult. I think it was harder earlier in my career, both because I was more younger and more junior and less experienced, but also because it was a tougher world for women when I was younger. I think things are much better now. I think it also varies enormously by sector. In some places I've worked, it's been much easier, and in some other places it's been more difficult. But I think the trend is very clear. And I think the other thing I'd say is that men are changing. I think men are changing. I think it's striking that many older men who have daughters would be outraged to think that their daughters would be discriminated against, and are using their positions to make sure that that doesn't happen to other women. And I think younger men have grown up in a different world and have very different expectations about work and life and their role in raising their children and their own career paths over time. So I think that also gives me great hope that the trajectory we're on will continue.
And your former boss, Christine Lagarde, once noted to you that if it were to be Lehman's sisters instead of brothers, the crisis of 2008 would have never happened. Do you share this sentiment that men and women carry different characteristics?
Well, it's there is a little bit of research on this issue about kind of risk-taking behavior and how that might vary between men and women. I think it's very hard to make a generalization because not all men are alike and not all women are alike, and there's a spectrum and all the rest of it. But I do feel very strongly that all the evidence shows that having people with different backgrounds, with different approaches, results in better decision making. I always remember a little exercise I did very early on in my career where we were all given a list of things we would take to the Arctic, and you had to rank order of all these things that you needed to take on an Arctic adventure, which would be the most important. And so every individual ranked, and then we all had to rank as groups. No individual, and then of course there was a right answer that the Arctic experts knew. No individual got a better score than any team. So no individual was smarter than the worst team. And that experience always sticks with me. And the reason the teams are better is because you've got all sorts of different knowledge and expertise and life experiences, and the process of coming to a decision together means that everybody learns a little bit. And so I think that is the most compelling reason why we need teams that are diverse, that have women, that have men, that have people of different backgrounds and different life experiences. And I think for me, that's I feel very strongly about that.
Great. Well, let's make it a team effort. If you'd like to ask a question, then please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to be carried over to you. So if we can have first row, please.
Thank you very much, Dame Shafik. Behavioural science tells us that fear and self-interest are some of the greatest drivers influencing what we believe. So knowing that, those in public policy, should we go with that and use fear and self-interest to drive better policy? So for example, in climate science, using fear of the consequences as a way of getting better policy, or is that succumbing to the wrong instincts?
Yeah, I guess my view would be that I would kind of take it sequentially. So I would start with appealing to people's better nature in terms of the arguments I would use to persuade people to do the right thing. But as you know, people are motivated by different things. And if appealing to their better nature and the common good, I would use fear if that was necessary. I've seen this in many international negotiations when you try and get a group of countries to agree on something. And appealing to the common good is usually the first place you go. And that gets you some people on side. But others are, really need to be told, if you don't do this, it's going to look really bad for you, or your country is going to be an outlier, or your country might be damaged because others will retaliate. And that is sometimes necessary to persuade people to do things they might not do on their own bat. But I don't like to start there.
Next question? Yes. Front row.
Thank you so much, Dame Shafik. You started by saying that central bank independence is a great example of rising expertise, but we see that under threat around the world, in the new US, to some extent here, a backlash against the ECB. How do you think we can protect central bank independence better, as well as sort of protect the ability for central banks across the world to coordinate? Because I know that's something that you've spoken about, the Bank of England has researched.
Yes. Well, I think we have to keep reminding people how much central bank has delivered in terms of price stability. People forget that we used to have inflation of 15-20% in many countries for many, many years. And people forget that high inflation hurts the poor the most. And I think we just have to keep hammering home, because it's been a long time since we've had such high inflation, and I think in the collective memory of many people, they don't remember that. So I would keep emphasizing that. I think the other thing is to keep reminding people about the boundary issues, that central banks are given an interest rate target by the democratically elected government. And if the government wants to change the inflation target, that is completely their prerogative. Our job is, once we're given the target, our job is to deliver it and be operationally independent in how we deliver it. But then we're also held to account by the democratically elected parliament and brought in regularly for parliamentary hearings to be challenged on whether we've done our job properly. And so reminding people of those clear accountabilities and division of labor is very, very important. And then your final point on central bank policy coordination. Central bankers are a very interesting tribe. I did not start my career as a central banker, and so I came to it late in my life. And it's very interesting. Every country has one central bank, right? By definition, right? It's the central bank. So they don't have other peers in their country who they can compare notes with. It's not like running a government department and there are other government departments, or a think tank or a university. And so their peer group is often other central banks. That's who they can compare notes with. That network is incredibly powerful. During the financial crisis, one of the things that saved the world economy was the fact that the central bankers knew each other, had met each other regularly, trusted each other, and could ring each other up and say, this bank in my country is in trouble, and it's got activities in your country, and you need to be aware of this. Or, I need a swap line because my banking system is short of your currency. Could you please, send me X billion of your currency? That network is so important for the stability of the global financial system. And we lose it at our peril. And I think reminding people again how important that network of well-functioning central banks was, it saved the world from an economic calamity in 2008, is also a very important thing to remember.
Next question. Can we go to a third row?
Hello, thank you for the talk. I have two separate questions. So I've read in the news media that you've been very involved in the bailout of Greece and the Eurozone negotiations around how to save the euro. Do you have any regrets, so after several years of the developments in the Eurozone, about not having pushed for a cut of the debt of Greece early on? So that's the first question. And the second question is, I've read that you will become the new director of the LSE, and I've seen that you get a very high salary, nearly £500,000. Do you think do you think so? In the current debate of the income inequality, do you think this is too much, too little, or like how do you think about this high salary in terms of the income inequality?
On Greece, in fact, the IMF has done a very good there's an independent evaluation office of the IMF, which has done a very good review of the first Greek program. And I think it's very clear that they conclude, and it's well worth a read, that there was probably a bit of over-optimism of how much reform the Greek economy and government could do, and that it would have been better if debt sustainability and debt reduction had been addressed earlier in the program. And that's in the public domain, and I think a very good analysis of what the lessons learned were from the early Greek program. And then the salary, I don't recognize that number, I'm afraid. And it's, I'm being paid just exactly what my predecessor was paid, with no addition above that.
Perfect. Next question. Can we go to the second row in the middle?
So on a related note to the first question asked by the gentleman opposite, under what circumstances do you think that you would advise a central bank, possibly in the developing world, to adopt a scheme of fixed exchange rates?
A scheme of fixed exchange rates? Yeah. Well, many developing countries have fixed exchange rate regimes, but there is definitely a tendency toward moving toward more floating regimes, because it gives the economy a mechanism to adjust to external shocks. And fixed exchange rate regimes are tougher to manage. Having said that, there are some economies who've had fixed exchange rate regimes for a very long time. Hong Kong, the Gulf countries, the oil economies. And it tends to be countries who are able to sustain fixed exchange rate regimes tend to have idiosyncratic characteristics, like being an oil economy and having almost all of your exports in dollars, so it makes sense to peg your exchange rate, for example, to the dollar. Most economies experience external shocks, and so retaining a fixed exchange rate is difficult when you face an external shock, and then you have these sharp adjustments in currency. So for me, I think it really depends on the structure of the economy. If you are an oil exporter and all your exports are in a particular currency, having a fixed exchange rate is more feasible. If your economy is subject to lots of external shocks and you may see frequent needs for adjustment on your current account, having regimes that allow floats, it doesn't have to be a full float, but a dirty float or some kind of adjustment mechanism, makes it easier for your economy to adjust to changes that it might face.
Perfect. Next question. Can we go to first row of the backbenches?
Yeah. Hi there, Andy Bruce from Reuters. I'm just wondering, I'm sure over the years at the bank, you've opened up a newspaper and read a headline saying, that you completely disagree with. For instance, I read a column from an MP last week who said that the Bank of England predicted a recession in the event of a Brexit vote, which is not true. What practical steps do you think the Bank of England could do to boost trust, basically, among the public? For instance, the bank has stepped back on the number of policy meetings it's holding each year, which is, from one perspective, would give fewer opportunities, perhaps, to get the message out there. Do policymakers like yourself need to be getting out in the country more, and or perhaps something else? Anyway, your thoughts on that? Thanks.
Yeah. I think we've done a huge amount in terms of increasing the transparency of what we do. We publish much more than we ever used to publish. We try and we now publish. We used to publish everything in little pieces. Now we publish everything in one go. The minutes of the meetings, the decision, the inflation report, all comes out at the same time to try and have real clarity around the messages. I think the next frontier for us in terms of communications is to be much more savvy about the new media and to find ways to communicate directly with the public about our expectations in language that is more accessible. I mean, I think the chart I showed about the accessibility about our publications, that's a problem. We need to do better than that. We need to find simple ways to describe complicated issues, but simple that are accurate and truly useful to people. And I think we also just need to find new methods of communication that, that are much more visual, that are much more on media that people tend to use. I spent part of the day today answering questions on Twitter for the first time. That was my introduction. I spent an hour where members of the public just tweeted in questions about the economy, and I had to answer those questions online. I think that kind of stuff needs to be much more common. And it 140 characters really focuses the mind. If that's all you've got to answer the question. But I think that's a challenge to us. But I think one that I think is definitely the direction that we will be going into.
Perfect. Next question. Can we go to the first row just here?
Thank you very much. Reflecting on your speech on experts and your upcoming job at the LSE, and reflecting on this institution as well, I'm interested in what you see as the role of academics, and if they're an obligation these days to communicate more directly with the public. There's a lot of people holed up in small offices around this campus who probably know a lot more than what's going on in the media, and I'm wondering how you see that relationship in future.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very important that academics maintain their standards for rigor, because in the long run, the reputation of universities for being places where people genuinely seek the truth is very, very important. It's interesting. There are just like some experts try and become politicians, some academics try and become politicians. And I think it's really important to be clear about what you're being at a particular point in time. If you are going to be a politician, be a politician. But if you're going to be an academic, be an academic. And maintain those principles of rigor, of peer review, of subjecting your findings to challenge by your peers who are equipped to judge whether you've done it properly. Having said that, I do think, and the LSE is a very good example. The LSE has never been an ivory tower. It's always been a university that's engaged actively with the world and interested in shaping public discourse. But I think we get the credibility to do that because people know that we are independent, that we're very clear about where the research is being funded and if there's any potential bias, and that it's been subjected to rigorous peer review. I think holding on to that will ultimately advance the power of the voice of the academy in public debate, and it's something that I'm very keen to do when I go to the LSE.
Next question. Can we go to second row over here, please? Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. Following up on your comment about new media, what role, if any, do you think social media platforms have in kind of signaling information, or do you think, such as Facebook and Twitter, or do you think that has a danger of creating a selection bias?
Yeah. I mean, I do believe very strongly that having, a vibrant media landscape with many, many different views is good for democracy and is where we want to be. I do think that platforms have some responsibility for propagating fake news if that is the case. I think where we are now is not the right place. We're at a transitional moment, and I think everybody's trying to figure out what is the right balance between encouraging freedom of speech which is vital, to the risks of promoting disinformation. You know, I think a lot of this hinges on whether these platforms are publishers or just platforms. Because if you're a publisher, you have a duty to inform and you have a duty to ensure of the quality of what you're publishing. If you're just a platform, well, it's not your responsibility. And I think that's exactly the policy issue that's being debated now. You know, ultimately, I think there's so much pressure on these platforms at the moment that users are unhappy with what is happening, and so they will be pressured to come up with some proposals. And I think they certainly have resources and capacity to do better than where we are now. So I would be keen to see what they come up with in terms of standards that they set for themselves and that hopefully their users demand, so that if a story comes up on several fact-checking websites as false, as a user, I'd like to know that. I'd like to know that this story has been flagged as false by, 2 or 3 fact-checking websites. I think that's something that users should be demanding, and those that, propagate those stories, which with potentially damaging consequences, it should be flagged. I'm not saying it should be, regulated and we should have laws and all that. I'm saying provide people with the tools so that they know that this website is funded by, this blogger is funded by so-and-so, or by this party or this interest group or whatever, that this piece of information has been identified as potentially untrue by a number of other sources. And so I think I guess I would take a more enabling approach to the question. How do you enable consumers to make informed judgments about the information they're getting?
Well, I think this is all that we unfortunately have time for this evening. I ask you all to remain in your seats, and I wish you best of luck in your new role as director of the LSE. And before leaving, I would like to ask you all to join me in thanking you for this evening. Thank you very much.